Welcome back. Today, we are stepping into a quiet corner of American history where time seems to have stopped but questions never did. Our story begins in 1959, in the United States, with a case that would slowly fade from headlines yet stubbornly refuse to disappear from memory. This is the story of the Walker family murders, an event that still lingers as an unresolved shadow more than half a century later. The year 1959 was a moment of contrast in America. On the surface, the country appeared calm and optimistic. Post-war prosperity was shaping suburbs, families were settling into routines built on stability, and the idea of home symbolized safety above all else. It was during this seemingly ordinary time that the Walker family lived their lives in Florida, far removed from the chaos often associated with major cities or crime headlines. When news broke that an entire family of 4 had been found killed inside their home, the shock was immediate and profound. Incidents involving whole families were rare, and when they happened, they challenged the deeply held belief that home was a sanctuary. The Walker case did exactly that. It unsettled not only a local community, but also law enforcement officers who were unprepared for the complexity and silence surrounding the crime. From the very beginning, investigators faced an uphill battle. There were no clear witnesses stepping forward, no obvious suspects waiting in the wings, and no immediate explanation that made sense. The timeline was uncertain, and the lack of reliable leads turned what should have been a straightforward investigation into a maze of unanswered questions. Every door detectives opened seemed to lead to another dead end. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, public attention slowly drifted away. Other stories replaced it in the newspapers, yet the Walker murders remained unresolved. This period marked the beginning of the case's transformation from a breaking news story into a quiet, haunting mystery. For the family left behind in memory, there was no closure, only speculation. Years later, the case resurfaced in conversations among true crime researchers and historians. Some began to question whether the murders could be connected to larger patterns of violence occurring around the same time. One name, in particular, emerged in speculation: Charles Starkweather, a notorious figure whose crimes shocked the nation in the late 1950s. The possible connection was tempting: overlapping timelines, similar levels of brutality, and Starkweather's known movements across states. However, speculation is not proof. Despite repeated reviews and renewed interest, no definitive evidence ever tied Starkweather or anyone else to the Walker family murders. The theory remained exactly that, a theory. Law enforcement could not move forward without facts solid enough to stand in court, and so the case stayed frozen in uncertainty. Today, the Walker family murders are remembered not for answers, but for their absence. They serve as a reminder that even in times that appear peaceful, darkness can exist unnoticed, and that some stories in history never truly end. They simply wait, unanswered, for someone to listen again. At the heart of this story is a family of 4 living in Florida, ordinary people whose lives unfolded far from national attention until they became the center of a mystery that would outlive them. Understanding who they were is essential, because the Walker family murders are not just an unsolved case. They are a reminder that real lives stood behind the headlines. The Walker family represented the image many Americans associated with the late 1950s: stability, routine, and privacy. Florida, still developing its modern identity at the time, was seen as a place of quiet neighborhoods and close-knit communities. Families knew one another, daily schedules were predictable, and unusual events rarely went unnoticed. This sense of familiarity made what happened to the Walkers all the more unsettling. Very little about the family suggested they were at risk. There were no widely reported disputes, no known involvement in dangerous circles, and no signs that trouble was expected. By all outward appearances, they lived a typical family life, one defined by shared meals, work, school routines, and the everyday rhythm of domestic life. This normalcy would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. When authorities discovered that all 4 members of the household had died, the realization hit hard: there had been no single target, no obvious motive focused on just one individual. The entire family had been taken, erasing a whole household in a single event. For investigators, this raised immediate questions. Was the family targeted for a specific reason, or were they victims of chance? Were they known to the person responsible, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Neighbors and community members were left struggling to reconcile the image they had of the Walkers with the reality of the crime. People who had exchanged greetings, shared brief conversations, or simply recognized familiar faces were suddenly forced to accept that something unimaginable had occurred nearby. Fear quietly spread, not through panic, but through uncertainty. If this could happen to a family like the Walkers, could it happen to anyone? The absence of surviving family members also meant the loss of personal context. There were no first-hand accounts to clarify final movements, no one left to explain unusual details or missing pieces. Investigators had to reconstruct lives through fragments, habits, routines, and second-hand recollections rather than direct testimony. This lack of personal insight would haunt the case for decades. Over time, the Walker family became known less for who they were and more for what was taken from them. Their identities faded into the background of the mystery, overshadowed by theories and speculation. Yet remembering them as a family, 4 individuals sharing one home and one life, is crucial. Their story is not only about unanswered questions, but about the sudden silence left behind when an entire household disappears from history. The discovery of what had happened to the Walker family sent a wave of disbelief through their Florida community. News traveled quickly, not through sensational headlines at first, but through hushed conversations, phone calls, and concerned neighbors gathering in small groups. In places where people were used to calm routines and familiar faces, this kind of event felt almost unreal. For many residents, the most disturbing detail was not just the loss itself, but where it occurred. The family had been found inside their own home, a place associated with safety, privacy, and rest. This detail alone shattered the comforting assumption that danger existed only somewhere else. Suddenly, doors were locked more carefully, lights stayed on longer at night, and ordinary sounds felt unfamiliar. Local authorities arrived knowing they were facing something far beyond a routine investigation. From the earliest moments, it was clear this case would not offer easy answers. There were no immediate signs pointing clearly in one direction. No obvious suspect waiting to be questioned, and no single explanation that fit neatly with what was known about the family. Each detail raised more questions than it resolved. The emotional impact on the community was immediate. Parents looked at their children differently, and neighbors re-examined their own daily habits. People replayed past interactions in their minds, wondering if they had missed something unusual or overlooked a warning sign. Even simple memories, seeing the family's lights on in the evening or noticing their car parked outside, took on a heavier meaning. As word spread beyond the neighborhood, public interest grew. Newspapers reported the basic facts, careful not to speculate too wildly in the early days. Still, the tone was unmistakable: this was not an ordinary incident. Entire families disappearing from daily life without explanation left a deep psychological mark, both locally and beyond state lines. Investigators worked under intense pressure. The expectation from the public and from within law enforcement was that answers would come quickly. Yet with each passing day, the lack of clear progress became harder to ignore. Interviews yielded little, and the absence of direct witnesses limited how far authorities could push their theories. What should have been the beginning of clarity instead became the beginning of uncertainty. The shock was compounded by silence. No claim of responsibility emerged. No clear motive presented itself. The case seemed suspended in time, frozen at the moment of discovery. This silence allowed fear and speculation to fill the gaps, even as officials urged patience and restraint. Over time, as days turned into weeks, the initial shock slowly settled into something heavier, a sense of unease that refused to fade. The Walker home became a symbol not just of loss, but of unanswered questions. For the community, it marked a dividing line between before and after, a reminder that even familiar places can hold unresolved mysteries. In the days following the discovery, investigators moved quickly, aware that time was their greatest enemy. The early phase of any case is often the most critical, when memories are fresh and details still sharp. Yet in the Walker family murders, progress was slow almost from the start, not due to a lack of effort, but because of a severe lack of usable information. One of the biggest challenges was the absence of reliable witnesses. No neighbors reported seeing anything clearly out of the ordinary, and no one could place a suspicious figure near the home with confidence. In a quiet Florida neighborhood where routines blended together, even small deviations were hard to separate from normal daily activity. This left investigators with timelines built on estimates rather than certainty. Physical evidence, which normally helps anchor an investigation, offered little guidance. What was found at the scene did not clearly point toward a specific individual or motive. Without modern forensic tools, authorities in 1959 were limited in how deeply they could analyze what they had collected. Many techniques taken for granted today simply did not exist or were still in their earliest stages. This technological gap meant that potential leads could not be fully explored. Interviews with friends, co-workers, and neighbors painted a picture of a family without known conflicts or threats. While this helped rule out some possibilities, it also deepened the mystery. Investigators often rely on patterns, disputes, financial stress, or personal connections to narrow their focus. In this case, those patterns were largely absent, leaving too many directions to pursue at once. As the investigation stretched on, the pressure intensified. Law enforcement agencies were expected to deliver answers, yet each lead seemed to fade under scrutiny. Rumors began to circulate, filling the silence left by official updates. Authorities had to balance transparency with caution, knowing that speculation could easily derail the case or harm innocent people. Gradually, resources were shifted elsewhere. New cases demanded attention, and without a strong breakthrough, the Walker investigation lost momentum. Files grew thicker, but clarity did not follow. What remained was a collection of unanswered questions rather than a clear narrative of events. This phase marked a turning point. The Walker family murders were no longer an active emergency but a lingering problem, one that refused to resolve itself. As time passed, memories faded, and the possibility of quick answers slipped further away. As weeks turned into months, the Walker family murders slowly drifted from the center of public attention. What once dominated local conversations and newspaper columns began to share space with newer stories. This shift did not mean the case was forgotten, but it did signal a critical change. Momentum was fading. And with it, the likelihood of swift answers. For investigators, this period was especially difficult. Without fresh leads, every review of the evidence led back to the same unresolved questions. Tips became less frequent, and those that did come in often relied on vague memories or second-hand information. Time, which can sometimes clarify events, worked in the opposite direction here, blurring details and weakening confidence in recollections. The emotional weight of the case also evolved. The immediate shock that once gripped the community settled into a quieter, more persistent unease. The Walker family home stood as a silent reminder of what had happened, yet daily life moved forward. People returned to routines, even as the absence of closure lingered in the background. From an official standpoint, the case began to take on a new label, unresolved. This did not mean it was abandoned. But it did mean active efforts slowed. Files were revisited periodically, evidence re-examined when possible, and theories discussed behind closed doors. Still, without new information, progress remained out of reach. Cold cases carry a unique kind of frustration. They exist in a state of suspension, neither solved nor fully dormant. For the Walker family murders, this status cemented their place in a growing list of American mysteries where time itself becomes a barrier to truth. Witnesses age, move away, or pass on. Physical evidence deteriorates or becomes outdated. What once seemed solvable begins to feel distant. Public memory followed a similar path. The case became something people had heard about, rather than something they actively discussed. Its details softened at the edges, preserved mainly in archived reports and the recollections of those who remembered the original shock. Yet for researchers and later storytellers, this very lack of resolution would become the reason the case endured. The cold status also left room for imagination. When official explanations stop, speculation often begins. Questions that once demanded factual answers gradually transformed into theories, some grounded in logic, others fueled by coincidence. This shift set the stage for the next chapter in the Walker story. Years after the Walker family murders had slipped into cold case status, the story quietly resurfaced not through official breakthroughs, but through renewed public curiosity. As time passed, researchers, writers, and true crime enthusiasts began revisiting unresolved cases from the 1950s, looking for patterns that may have been overlooked. The Walker case, with its unanswered questions and limited evidence, naturally drew attention once again. This renewed interest did not come from new physical discoveries, but from comparison. People began placing the Walker murders alongside other notorious crimes from the same era, searching for similarities in timing, movement, and behavior. The late 1950s had seen a number of highly publicized violent crime sprees, and the idea that some cases might be connected became a compelling line of inquiry. One name, in particular, began appearing in these discussions: Charles Starkweather. His actions in the late 1950s had already secured him a place in American criminal history, and his known movements across multiple states led some to question whether his reach might have extended further than officially documented. The Walker murders occurred during the same general period, making the comparison tempting. Supporters of this theory pointed to broad overlaps, chronology, geography, and the scale of violence as reasons to consider a possible connection. In the absence of answers, coincidence can feel meaningful, and unanswered cases often invite broader narratives to fill the gaps. For some, linking the Walker case to a known figure offered a sense of structure to an otherwise shapeless mystery. However, this renewed attention also highlighted the difference between theory and evidence. While similarities could be discussed, no direct proof emerged to support a definitive link. Law enforcement records did not confirm Starkweather's presence in the area at the relevant time, nor did physical evidence tie him or anyone else to the scene. The speculation remained exactly that, an idea without confirmation. Still, the impact of these discussions was significant. The Walker family murders were no longer confined to forgotten files. They had re-entered public conversation. Articles, forums, and documentaries began referencing the case, ensuring it would not disappear entirely from historical memory. Even without answers, the story regained visibility. This phase of renewed interest also raised important questions about how we remember unresolved cases. Does speculation help keep them alive, or does it risk overshadowing facts with assumptions? In the Walker case, both seemed to happen at once. The mystery endured, but clarity remained elusive. Ultimately, this chapter reinforced the case's defining feature, uncertainty. Despite decades of attention, review, and comparison, the truth behind the Walker family murders remained just out of reach. Despite renewed attention and decades of speculation, the Walker family murders never gained the one thing investigators needed most: definitive proof. Every theory, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually ran into the same wall: the absence of evidence strong enough to support clear conclusions. This lack of proof became the case's most defining feature. One major factor was timing. The crime occurred in 1959, long before many modern investigative methods were available. Techniques such as advanced DNA analysis, digital databases, and nationwide information sharing were either non-existent or extremely limited. Evidence that might be considered crucial today could not be fully examined or preserved in a way that would later allow for reanalysis. Another obstacle was the condition of the original investigation. While authorities worked with what they had, the lack of witnesses and clear leads meant that early decisions were often based on incomplete information. Once time passed, correcting or expanding upon those early steps became increasingly difficult. Memories faded, and opportunities to verify details disappeared. Speculation linking the case to well-known figures only highlighted this problem. Even when timelines seemed to align or behavioral patterns appeared similar, none of these elements could replace direct confirmation. Law enforcement agencies require solid, verifiable facts to move forward, especially in cases involving serious accusations. Without such evidence, theories remained outside the boundaries of official action. The physical evidence itself also posed challenges. Over the years, materials degrade, records are lost, and documentation standards change. What once seemed well preserved can become unusable decades later. In the Walker case, this erosion of evidence meant that even renewed reviews offered limited progress. This absence of proof created a difficult reality for everyone involved. For investigators, it meant working within strict limits, unable to push theories into formal conclusions. For the public, it meant living with uncertainty, an incomplete story that resisted resolution. And for the historical record, it meant a case defined more by questions than by answers. Yet this very lack of closure is what keeps the Walker family murders relevant. Unsolved cases challenge our assumptions about justice and understanding. They remind us that not every story ends neatly, and not every truth is uncovered, even with time and attention. As the years passed, the Walker family murders gradually took their place among a larger collection of unresolved cases in American history. These are stories that never reached a courtroom conclusion, never received a final explanation, yet refused to fade completely from public memory. The Walker case became one of those quiet references mentioned not for its answers, but for its lingering uncertainty. What distinguishes this case within that broader landscape is its simplicity on the surface and its complexity beneath. There was no extended sequence of events, no public trial, and no official resolution to follow. Instead, there was a single, devastating moment that left behind a permanent gap. That gap made the case easy to summarize, yet impossible to truly understand. For historians and researchers, cases like this serve as markers of their time. The Walker murders reflect both the limits of mid-20th century investigations and the social expectations of the era. Communities trusted that serious crimes would be solved, and when they were not, the failure felt personal. The unresolved nature of the case quietly challenged that confidence. Public memory also shaped how the case endured. Without new developments, the story survived through retellings, brief references, and comparisons to other mysteries. Each generation that encountered the Walker family murders saw them through a different lens, some focusing on investigative shortcomings, others on broader social fears, and still others on speculative connections. The facts stayed the same, but the interpretations shifted. Importantly, the Walker case highlights how unsolved crimes often become symbolic. They stand in for unanswered questions about safety, justice, and the limits of certainty. Rather than offering closure, they ask the audience to sit with discomfort. In this way, the Walker family murders became less about identifying a responsible party and more about acknowledging the silence left behind. This placement among America's unsolved cases also ensured that the Walker family would not be entirely forgotten. Their story continued to appear in lists, discussions, and historical overviews not as a solved chapter, but as a reminder that some truths remain out of reach. Memory, in these cases, becomes a form of preservation. Over time, this quiet persistence turned the case into a reference point. It was no longer just a local tragedy from Florida, but part of a national pattern of unresolved history. That shift expanded its significance beyond its original setting. As the Walker family murders settled into cold case status, much of what kept the story alive came from speculation and storytelling. Without clear answers, people naturally began filling in gaps through articles, books, and later, online discussions. The case slowly transformed from a factual investigation into a narrative shaped as much by imagination as by evidence. One key factor in this evolution was the human tendency to search for patterns. Writers and researchers drew parallels between the Walker murders and other violent crimes of the era, particularly those committed by notorious figures like Charles Starkweather. The similarities in timing, brutality, and geographic proximity made for compelling theory building. Even if there was no concrete proof, the narrative was powerful and drew attention. Media coverage, especially in retrospective accounts, emphasized mystery and suspense. Headlines often highlighted the unsolved or baffling aspects, which naturally attracted public curiosity. Over time, the story became less about the specifics of the Walker family and more about the enigma surrounding their deaths. While this helped preserve awareness, it also introduced distortions, details sometimes exaggerated or inferred, rather than confirmed by official records. For historians and crime enthusiasts, these retellings served a dual purpose. On one hand, they ensured the Walker family murders remained part of the collective memory, inspiring renewed interest and occasional re-examinations. On the other hand, the blending of fact and theory made it harder for newcomers to separate verified evidence from conjecture. The line between historical documentation and storytelling grew thinner with each iteration. Yet, the power of storytelling also gave the case enduring significance. The Walker family murders became emblematic of broader questions: the unpredictability of violence, the limits of mid-century investigative methods, and the haunting nature of unsolved crimes. Through these narratives, the case extended beyond a single neighborhood in Florida to become a point of reflection on American history and society at large. This phase of the story underscores a critical lesson. The way a case is remembered can be just as impactful as the facts themselves. Even decades after the event, the Walker family murders continue to evoke emotion, discussion, and curiosity, demonstrating the lasting power of unresolved human stories. The Walker family murders left a lasting mark not only on investigators and historians but also on the local Florida community where it all occurred. Even as time passed, the sense of fear and uncertainty lingered, reminding residents that violence could strike anywhere, even in the most seemingly safe neighborhoods. Neighbors, once familiar with each other's routines and lives, began to view ordinary activities with suspicion. The daily rhythms of life, children playing in the yard, neighbors chatting on porches, or families walking home from work, took on an undercurrent of tension. If a family like the Walkers could be targeted without warning, the implicit assumption of safety within one's home was shattered. The absence of resolution compounded these feelings. Unlike cases that end in arrest or trial, the Walker murders offered no closure. Residents could not attribute the crime to a known perpetrator, and there was no concrete explanation to help them process the tragedy. Over time, This left a lingering anxiety that subtly influenced behavior, relationships, and community cohesion. Local authorities also felt the weight of the case's impact. Even after the investigation slowed, they were acutely aware that the public remembered the fear as much as the facts. The case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that violent crime can touch ordinary lives unpredictably. In some ways, the Walker murders shaped community practices around home security and vigilance. Long before such measures became standard in American neighborhoods. The broader public, encountering the case through newspapers and later historical accounts, also absorbed a sense of unease. For readers and listeners outside Florida, the Walker family murders symbolized the fragility of safety and the unsettling possibility of sudden, unexplained violence. This emotional resonance helped keep the story alive across decades and distances, even without any formal closure. Over time, attention turned toward potential suspects, as researchers and crime enthusiasts attempted to make sense of the Walker family murders. Among the names that surfaced most often was Charles Starkweather, the infamous spree killer active in the late 1950s. His crimes, which involved multiple victims across several states, bore certain similarities to the Walker case, making the connection an alluring possibility for theorists. Supporters of the Starkweather link pointed to overlapping timelines, geographic proximity, and comparable levels of violence. Starkweather's known movements and the brutal nature of his killings appeared to mirror aspects of the Walker murders, at least superficially. In the absence of definitive leads, such comparisons offered a framework for understanding an otherwise inexplicable event. However, the theory had significant limitations. No hard evidence ever tied Starkweather to the Walkers. Law enforcement records, travel logs, and witness accounts failed to confirm his presence in the area at the critical time. The similarity in circumstances remained circumstantial, leaving the connection firmly in the realm of speculation. Beyond Starkweather, other potential suspects were occasionally considered, but none yielded conclusive leads. Investigators and later researchers could identify patterns or motives in general, but no individual emerged with enough credibility to move the case toward closure. The combination of limited evidence and the passage of time effectively prevented any theory from being confirmed. This focus on suspects illustrates a key aspect of unsolved cases. Theories often fill the vacuum left by missing facts. When the truth is inaccessible, speculation becomes a way for the public to process fear, curiosity, and frustration. Yet it also highlights the challenge of balancing conjecture with the historical record. While Starkweather remains a name frequently mentioned, the Walker family murders continue to exist in a space between fact and theory, a space that resists definitive explanation. Decades later, the Walker family murders remain an enduring mystery, not because of sensational headlines or dramatic twists, but because of the profound absence of answers. For ordinary lives were abruptly ended, and despite investigation, speculation, and comparison with other cases, no definitive explanation has ever emerged. This unresolved nature gives the story a haunting quality that continues to draw attention. Part of the case's lasting impact lies in its human element. The victims were family, parents and children living a typical life in a Florida neighborhood. Their abrupt, violent deaths challenged the assumption that everyday life is inherently safe. Unlike other high-profile crimes with clear perpetrators and resolutions, the Walker case reminds us of life's fragility and the unsettling reality that some events leave no closure. The case also holds historical significance. Occurring in 1959, it highlights the limitations of mid-20th century investigative methods. Without modern forensic tools like DNA analysis or advanced databases, authorities were constrained in what they could discover. The Walker murders stand as a testament to both the challenges of past law enforcement and the evolution of criminal investigation over the decades. Speculation, particularly linking the case to notorious figures like Charles Starkweather, has ensured its continued presence in public discourse. Even though no concrete evidence supports these theories, they reflect a broader human need to find patterns and explanations for senseless events. The combination of fact, theory, and unanswered questions keeps the case alive in historical memory and true crime communities alike. Ultimately, the Walker family murders endure because they are emblematic of unresolved tragedy. They remind us that not every story ends neatly, that some questions resist answers, and that memory itself becomes a way to honor those who were lost. Even in the absence of justice or closure, the case continues to captivate, teach, and provoke reflection, ensuring that the Walkers, and the mystery surrounding their deaths, are not forgotten. As we reach the end of our journey through the haunting story of the Walker family murders, it is clear that some mysteries never truly fade. From the ordinary life of a family in Florida, to the sudden and tragic loss of all four members, this case has left more questions than answers. Investigators struggled with scarce evidence, theories emerged and faded, and decades of speculation sometimes linked to notorious figures like Charles Starkweather have only deepened the sense of unresolved mystery. Yet, in the absence of closure, the story still teaches us something important. It reminds us of the fragility of everyday life, the limits of human understanding, and the enduring need to remember those who were lost. Cases like the Walker murders show how history is shaped not just by what we know, but also by what remains unanswered, lingering in memory and cautioning future generations. Thank you for joining us today as we explored this chilling chapter of American history. If you are fascinated by true crime and unsolved mysteries, do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Until then, stay curious and remember, sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that remain unanswered.